I'm going to go over the initial steps for creating an Omniverse project directly out of Rhino. I'm using Rhino 7, but everything we're going to see here will also work in Rhino 6. I have a simple scene set up. It is what is like a landscape park design that I set up in Rhino. So a few things to note. I did do a lot of the material and texture mapping here in Rhino, using all of the default Rhino texture mapping tools, inside of an object, using the texture map tools and things like that. The material type I'm using is PBR, but any, Rhino basic material would work as well. So you can see here, I just have a material and it's just got some color and normal map on it and things like that, just basic textures. But the normal Rhino basic material will also translate in terms of color and texture and bump, all of that kind of stuff. So you can set up your layers exactly as you would. You don't have to do anything special for Omniverse in this case. All of your layers and sublayers will directly translate, which I'll show you, which is great. The Omniverse Exporter by default is, as is for most of the exporters in the AEC side, is what you see is what you get. So if you hide an object or you have a layer turned off, it won't export. It'll only export what it sees on the screen by default. And I'll show you an option. There is an export selected, if you wanted to use that instead and kind of just select a bunch of objects and just do that. You can also choose that option. But in this case, I want to export the whole scene out. So to get started, basically you want to go to the Omniverse tab and click the little person. Make sure you're signed into the right server. And I'm actually going to just use my local host, which is basically the Nucleus server that runs on the workstation I'm currently on instead of one of the global ones we have just for this test. So that's it. I'm signed in. And you have 3 ways to export stuff out. The first one is send to Omniverse. And basically that's like a instant, what you see is what you get kind of way of doing things. You click that button, it'll open up, it'll create temporary files in the background, and it'll just view it for you. That's for a very quick preview. We're not going to kind of go over that one in this video. I'm going to show you the more permanent way where you're working with a larger team and you want to kind of have more persistent files and control over it. The other one is, this is export project. What project's going to do is it's going to set up a whole set of files and folders for you. Again, the project workflow we're going to cover in another video. I'm going to show you the one I use 99% of the time, which is what we call prop workflow. And basically, that's just going to give you a lot more control over exactly where the file goes and how it's managed in your file and folder structure. Because I have a very specific way that I like to work with a very specific folder structure that I like. And if you also have, a folder structure in which you like to keep things in sort of hierarchy, the prop workflow is going to be the one you want to choose because you'll have more fine-grained control over that. So we'll just jump right into it. Just to kind of note some things, and I'm going to kind of explain it in a second. These are blocks, and I'll talk about how blocks can become these magical things in Omniverse. Using something called asset swap. I will touch on that very quickly in this video, but we'll go into more depth a little bit later in another video about material and asset swapping within Rhino. So basically what we want to do to get started is just click publish, and it's going to open up the publish dialog. So before we jump into this, I just want to show you the publish options so that you understand them clearly. So the right side here is what you really want to kind of concentrate on. This stuff is the send to view options. We don't really have to do much here because we're not using the send to view button, but it lets you choose, what server you want the temporary file to sit on, and like the default size, and whether a project or prop workflow. Again, we're not doing the send to view in this demo, so we're going to kind of just really concentrate here. So like I said before, export selected, that is an option. I'm going to keep that off. Separate by objects. This is a very important and powerful option that you definitely need to know. So one way to make the USD a little bit more efficient is to take anything that's on this layer and collapse it to a single mesh. This layer might have 30 objects on it, but what it'll do is it'll collapse it down to a single object. Now, doing that is a lot more efficient, but you lose control over the individual objects. So for this particular workflow, I actually want to keep that on because I want access to each individual object, and I'll show you that in the stage viewer. Use material mapping. Obviously I want my materials to come over. So if you uncheck that, it basically bring them over, forgetting about materials. That's a good workflow if you're trying to do all of your material mapping in another software. It's one of the amazing powers of Omniverse. You can completely do the material mapping if you prefer in Create itself, or hand it over to a Viz team, and they'll do all the material mapping in Max, while maintaining the link, right? So like you can still model and they can still material map in Max, and you don't have to worry about that. So that's why you have it as an option. So when I have this checked, I almost always have this checked. It's the same thing. It's going to also then translate the Rhino materials. So this is going to be your UVs and your texture mapping. That's going to get translated. This is the actual material itself. Now, if you don't have a lot of well-done materials yet, but you do want it to create some temporary materials for you, this is a great option. So if I check this option, it's going to create a material per layer name. And then again, if I check this, I almost always check this. And then that way you'll have a material and it'll be called hardscape or stepped logo or pavement lights. And it won't have any actual material other than it'll be set to like the default white. But what that does is it'll then allow you to go in and override those, but it'll have assigned a material to each object that sits in that layer. So for this file, since I have gone through the effort of doing all my material mapping in Rhino, and I do have textures, and I want the entire scene, this is the setup I'm going to be using. I want the separate objects, and I want it to use my materials, and I don't want materials by layer. So that's why all of those options are there. Now that we're in this dialog, I'm basically going to just go, this is the Omniverse server itself. This is the Nucleus server, and I'm going to go into projects, and I'm just going to create a new top level folder, and I'm just going to call it Rhino Test Project. And then you just click the little button to get a new folder, and you'll see Rhino Test Project. And then I'm just going to kind of put everything in here because I'm not going to kind of go over like file organization or anything like that. I'm just going to kind of put the file in here. And I'm just going to call this Rhino because I always like to append where it comes from because one beautiful thing about Omniverse is it could be coming from Revit or Rhino or Max or Maya or Unreal. So I kind of append it with the app because it just makes it easier to understand where did the source come from. So that way, if I'm looking at something, I know like, okay, that's a Rhino file. Let me go find the Rhino file that matches. And we'll call it Park Test. And just click Export. It's that simple. All right. So now on my Create side. So now I have Create open. And same thing. I'm going to go to my local host. I'm going to expand that. And you're going to see that under projects, I have a project called Rhino Test Project. And in there, I have my USD file. And in there, it created a folder for materials. And there's all my materials. And it translates over the textures. It brings them in. It makes the MDLs. Everything comes over pretty nicely. So this is an important first step when you're using the prop workflow is that we never want to edit the file that came directly out of the DCC app. And the reason for that is we don't want to override anything in here. What we want to use is USD's non-destructive layer editing abilities to kind of put all my edits on top of this file. So now that we have that, I'm going to just create a blank file that we're going to use as the world container to hold this file. Now this container is great because it can hold multiple files, not just the Rhino file. It can hold other pieces as you would need to build an entire scene. So I'm just going to create a blank USD file by right-clicking and going to New USD. And I'm going to call it world because that's how I like to append files that I know are just sort of scene compositions. Rhino Park test. And it just creates a blank USD file. This is the file I'm going to open. First thing we got to do though is when you create a new USD file, it is going to be defaulted as Y up. So we want to go to the layer palette, the menu, and click on the layer itself, and you'll get the options down here. We need to change Y to Z. Great. Stay in the layer palette and drag your Rhino export just directly in here. So now this becomes a sublayer of the world. And by doing that, it's going to actually open everything. Now, since this is my authoring layer, and again, there will be a larger demo video explaining the idea of layers in much more detail, because there is some amazing complexities you can do with layers and the ability to do non-destructive overrides and optioning and things like that. So I highly encourage you kind of watch some of the videos dedicated to just the idea of USD layers, because they are amazing and they are powerful and they are what sort of glue all of this system together. So I'm going to keep that as my authoring layer. Never want to author in here. And then we can just press F to go find the object, and there it is. So the scene has no light. So if one of the first things we want to do is jump to the sky, right-click on one of them. I'm going to use a dynamic sky so I can change the time of day. So if it's not a dynamic sky, you won't be able to change the time of day. The other ones that aren't dynamic are basically just HDRIs. So, and you can use as many HDRIs as you want. These are actual sky models where you can adjust the sun and time of day and lighting and cloud density and all of that kind of thing. So there we go. We set them to the world. Excellent. So you can see my textures came over really nice. All of that sort of came through. So the detail and the material mapping, all of my UV coordinates, all of that came through directly from Rhino with very little effort in terms of setting the things up. There are a couple things that we do want to change. So for instance, in Rhino, I just made a little block at the bottom of these embedded lights. If we look at pavement lights, there's just a little thing at the bottom that says light, and it's just a box. And I didn't even apply a material to it, and it's because I didn't, need to, because I'm gonna be using something within Create as a material. And this is one of the nice things. So I can kind of override the materials in here. So if we go to the stage and we look at the world and we look at park and we look at geometry. So my blocks will sit in here. Those are my street lights. I'll show you why those didn't come in a sec. They're in there as blocks. And geometry. So we have a perfect matching layer structure exactly as it is in Rhino. So if I go to pavement lights, you can see I have light box, glass, light, frame. So those are all the different pieces and the meshes underneath them. So to override the light, because I basically just want those meshes to actually be real lights, I can do it at the upper level or I can do it on each object. I'm just going to do it at the group level. I'm going to go to materials and choose emissive and just pick one of these. You know, that one seems fine. And right click and apply to selected. Now, when you apply something to a parent of these are children and that's its parent. When you apply something to a parent, by default, it says weaker than descendant, which basically means, all right, if this thing doesn't have a material on it, it's going to take this material. If it does have a material on it, well, it's going to use the default one. So in order for this to override all of the children underneath it, we just basically have to say, nope, this is going to be stronger than the material on its descendant. And you can see it now all changes. And what's cool is that's an actual emissive material. So if we show you, go to Windows and we go to Sun Study, you can see I can actually change the time of day. And one of the things I can do is I can change the time of day so much that it is now nighttime. And keep going to night. And I'm going to go into Path Trace. And you can see they're emissive. And obviously we're going to, you know, since it's night, we're going to go to post-processing and we're going to go to tone mapping. And this is your camera settings, your ISO, and all of those kinds of things. So we're going to just make it a little bit brighter. And so you can see. And then we can, you know, obviously go back to the light itself. So those would be under something called looks. And there's the light. And the light has, you know, color and all of those kinds of things. But if you go down to the emissive, it's got a, you know, intensity. So I'll just make it like way too unrealistic and just drag it up by another 50,000. And you can see that they illuminate in the pathway, which is really nice. And we can change the time of day. I'm going to change it back. And if you want, we can just switch this to auto exposure. And then that way, like when I change the time of day, I don't have to worry about the exposure. All you do is you just set you know, a white point scale, which basically means like how bright do you want it to be, and it's going to try and always maintain that brightness regardless of the time of day. So it'll just, you know, adapt. So now you can see it's adapting a little bit to that white point scale, and actually we can use that to really you know, really get it like super bright at night, you know, so that you get that kind of like light glow. But, you know, that's about right for over there. And let's put it back towards the day, which is important. Okay. So you have the ability to go between Rhino materials and create materials. You know, there are some things that are easy to do in Rhino, like, you know, these pavement textures, but water, you know, not so great. So again, you know, I'm going to actually switch to the V materials library and go to water, or it's liquid. It's a liquid. And I'll use, let's say, water, a little bit greenish color, and I'll apply that. And then you can see, it doesn't look great because I did not adjust the textures, but that's fine. We can go in here and go to that water. And there's a property that you use all the time, which is the texture scale. And we can just adjust this to match. It's a little bit bumpy for my liking. So we're just going to decrease the wave strength. And that seems a lot better. It's still definitely a little bit bright. Yeah, so there we go. So now we got some nice water going on in there. Also, one of the things you want to change is how many under your path tracing. By default, it's at 64. That's not enough. I set that to 3000. I set this to 16, and I set this to 12, and it's just going to just create a lot more reflections and refractions, and just it's going to resolve much better. You can see it resolving. All right, so why did my lights come over? It's because I have the asset that I swap it with on another server. So I'm just going to kind of move that over, and I'll show you what that means in a minute under my content browser. Okay, so I copied the street light that I want to use into my project folder. It can live anywhere you want, but I copied it into my project folder. And if we go back to Rhino, it's important to kind of just check out a couple things. So this is just a block. And if I go to the block manager, I have one block called, or I have two blocks, but we're going to concentrate on this one. A block called Streetlight 01. And I'm just using a stand-in. It's basically two cylinders on top of each other. It's just a basic stand-in because I don't want the full res model in here. I want this thing to stay light and quick. And the cool thing is this works for anything, trees and bushes and shrubs and props, anything you want. So it just will match that. If we go to, I'm going to go into a folder and hold on one second. So if you go into your documents folder, you're going to have something called Omniverse. And in that is all of your connectors. So if you go into Rhino, there's going to be a couple CSV files. The one we really want is the block table. It's going to automatically populate this table for you when you export, which is really nice. And if I open it up, it's going to open Excel for me. And let's look at it. So there's just two lines, two very simple lines. The name of the block in Rhino and the name of the object you want that to be. So the reason it didn't go is because I was using this project on another server and it was pointed somewhere else. I'm going to kind of change that for you. And I want you to kind of see I opened up a blank version of Create. And if I go into the projects folder, Rhino test project, and I go into Streetlight, I'm just going to open that up. So this is kind of a high poly model. It's kind of hard to see because I don't have any like environment or lighting in there, but it's basically a higher poly model, with, all the pieces modeled. There's little bolts and stuff in there. There's actual lighting elements and all of that kind of stuff. This was modeled, in another software, and it, and then it's got I used a little emitter instead of an actual light, because, I like the kind of way it throws that light, as the object, right? So if we copy this, I'm just going to right click on this asset and you can just say copy URL link. And we go back here, you can paste it right there, and you just have to remove the Omniverse, like the server part. So everything up until localhost, basically that, projects, Rhino, test project, Streetlight 01 USD, and save it. And that's all you really have to do. So if I go back to this version of Create, actually, I'm going to go back to Rhino. So now that it knows where that actually is located, I'm actually going to close this to make sure that it's saved. Yep, great. So now that it knows where that is, I'm going to just kind of overwrite the other project. And I can do this safely without worrying about any of the changes I made, because remember that layered structure. So I can go to Rhino, Park Test, and do this, and all of my material edits that I did in Create will still remain because it's actually all those edits actually live here. So I'm going to export this back out, and I'm going to go to Create, which I probably should have put in Live Sync, which if we go to Layers, you would just click this. It's going to know that a change happened, and it's going to refresh it for me. Okay, so now you can see what happened is all of those blocks that were just basic stand-ins have now become full res objects. So we can go back to sort of our render settings, make sure I'm still on auto exposure. Great. And so now if we go to the sun study again and drop the sun, now you can see all those lights illuminate. And I'll just make it even brighter. The other thing we can do is just go to the material itself. So if we go to the blocks and we look at the street light, oh, actually, it's a good thing to show. So like maybe those street lights aren't powerful enough. This is one of the power of like linked stuff. So I'm gonna make these dual screen. So this is a street light file on the right. This is just that street light. And this is the scene I'm working in. It doesn't import stuff. It's always linking to other assets. So if I go and change something in here, so like for instance, if I go down to the intensity of this light, which I actually have to go to its material to do that. And I think I bypassed the mission. There we go. And I'm just going to add another 0 to this and save it. Oh, I am not in live sync mode, so I'm going to make sure both of those are in live sync. There we go. You can see it just changed it. So they're linked. So I can go and make another 0 and save it. So it's going to take a second, and now they're really lit up. So this linked pieces within other pieces, it goes back to that layering structure, which is like really, really important. And if I bring the sun back, if I come back towards the day, it makes it really nice to just like control things that, you know, are different assets. So other people can be working on these assets. So if, for instance, I decided that like, no, I wanted that to look, you know, old and coppery, I'll go to metals. V material metals has a lot of metals on it. And let's make it old, and I know there's a copper in here. We just type in copper. This one looks good with some patina on it. Just apply it and then press save. And then that will update, and give it a second, and you can see my material building down here. And so now they're old coppery looking materials. So this linked objects, non-destructive editing, it's pretty fantastic in terms of a workflow. So then the next kind of thing we're going to want to do is I'm going to like two screen my Rhino and my, I'm going to have to make things a little bit smaller. Sorry. So let's go. I don't know. I'll stick with this particular light. So the other thing that's important to understand is, yeah, this seems about right, is you can also be working in real time if you would like. So for instance, I can go, since these two are already in live sync, I can go ahead and throw this one in Rhino into live sync. This dialog needs to stay open, so that's very important. Do not close this dialog. So I'm just going to push it off to the side so you can kind of see it's still there. But now that Rhino is in live sync and Create is in live sync, I can go ahead and start doing stuff, and watch it, change. So I'll move that there, and you can see that light moved. It's moving all about the scene. And it's very easy to kind of adjust stuff. To make it super obvious, I'll pull the water plane all the way up and I'll put it back down, and it makes sense. So that's really nice. And you can work, side by side. Somebody else could be, observing this on another computer while you're kind of working, kind of see the current state of the file, do design reviews, and you can kind of get the power of Omniverse. So this is a basic introduction. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next one.